People walk past starving men every day, pretending not to see them. B. Gallagher didn't. At £280, she knew exactly what it felt like to be invisible in a cruel world. So when a frail old man collapsed outside her diner, she didn't just give him a warm meal. She spent her last $20 to save him. She thought she was just feeding a homeless stranger. She had no idea she had just rescued the father of Leonardo Romano, the most ruthless and feared crime boss in the city. The rain in South Philadelphia didn't just fall. It punished. It lashed against the grease-stained windows of Rusty's diner, a decaying 24-hour joint that smelled perpetually of burnt coffee and old frying oil. It was 2 a.m. on a brutal Tuesday in November, and Beatrice B. Gallagher was exhausted. Her feet throbbed inside her non-slip shoes, and her back ached from carrying trays of heavy ceramic plates. Bea was a big woman, a fact the world never let her forget. At £280, her curves were soft and abundant, hidden beneath an unflattering, mustard-yellow uniform that clung to her in all the wrong places. Customers often looked right through her, treating her like part of the diner's worn-out furniture. Her manager, a balding, perpetually sweaty man named Gary Henderson, was even worse. He constantly made snide remarks about her weight, claiming she took up too much space behind the counter. But Bea endured it. She had a mountain of medical debt from her late mother's cancer treatments, an eviction notice threatening her door, and exactly $23 to her name until payday. The diner was mostly empty, save for 2 truckers nursing black coffee in the corner booth. Bea was wiping down the counter when she saw him. He was huddled on the pavement right outside the glass door, curled into a tight ball against the freezing rain. He wore a sodden, oversized tweed coat that looked decades old. He was shivering so violently that Bea could see his shoulders shaking from across the room. People had been walking past him for the last hour, stepping over his legs, averting their eyes. Gary emerged from the kitchen, wiping his hands on a filthy rag. He followed Bea's gaze and scowled. "Don't even think about it, Bea. If that old bum tries to come in here, I'm calling the cops. I run a restaurant, not a charity ward." "He's freezing, Gary," Bea said softly, her voice thick with empathy. "Look at him. He's going to catch pneumonia." "Not my problem, and it's not yours. Get back to the dishes." Gary turned and vanished into his tiny office, slamming the door. Bea looked back at the old man. Just then, he lifted his head. His face was pale, his cheeks hollowed out by hunger, and his silver hair was plastered to his skull by the rain. But it was his eyes that struck her. They were a piercing, vivid blue, clouded with a profound confusion and a desperate, silent plea. Bea didn't think. She just moved. She pushed open the heavy glass door, the icy wind slapping her in the face. "Sir," she called out, stepping into the downpour. "Sir, you can't stay out here." The old man blinked up at her. His lips were blue. "I'm lost," he rasped, his voice barely a whisper over the sound of the storm. "I can't find my way home, and I'm so hungry." Bea's heart broke. She reached down, her thick, strong arms wrapping gently under his frail shoulders. "Come on, let's get you inside." She practically carried him into the diner, ignoring the puddle of water he dripped onto the linoleum. She guided him to her section, sitting him down in the warmest booth right next to the radiator. She grabbed a clean towel from behind the counter and gently dried his silver hair. "My name is Bea," she said, offering him a warm, reassuring smile. "What's yours?" "Albert," he murmured, his hands shaking as he clutched the table. "Albert, I think. Yes." "Albert. Well, Albert, you look like you could use a hot meal." B walked over to the order wheel and wrote out a ticket. A massive bowl of the diner's hearty beef stew, a double order of mashed potatoes with thick gravy, and a large hot chocolate. She handed the ticket to the line cook, ignoring his raised eyebrow, and slapped her own crumpled $20 bill onto the counter to cover it. It was her grocery money for the rest of the week, but looking at Albert's hollow cheeks, she knew she couldn't keep it. When she brought the food over, Albert looked at it as if she had just placed a feast of gold in front of him. He ate ravenously, his hands trembling so badly, he dropped his spoon twice. B sat across from him, gently helping him steady his cup of hot chocolate. As the warmth returned to his face, Albert's blue eyes seemed to clear slightly. He looked at B, really looked at her. He didn't look at her with the pity or disgust she was so used to seeing. He looked at her with profound respect. "You have a kind soul, Beatrice," he said softly, his tone suddenly shifting from a confused old man to someone carrying quiet authority. "Most people look at a starving man and see trash. You looked at me and saw a human being." "Everyone deserves to eat, Albert," B said, blushing slightly. Suddenly, the door to the office flew open. Gary stormed out, his face purple with rage. "What the hell is this?" he screamed, pointing a stubby finger at Albert. "I told you no bums, B. Are you deaf?" "I paid for his food, Gary," B fired back, standing up to her full height, her sheer size and presence forcing the manager to take a half step back. "He's a paying customer. I don't care. He's stinking up the place. Get him out or you're fired." Albert slowly wiped his mouth with a napkin and stood up. Though frail, he stood with a sudden, rigid dignity. "Do not yell at her," Albert said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, gravelly timbre that sent an inexplicable chill down Gary's spine. "She is worth 10 of you." "Get out!" Gary barked. "It's okay, Albert," B said quickly, handing him the rest of his bread wrapped in a napkin. "The rain has stopped. You should find a shelter." Albert looked at her, reached into his sodden coat pocket, and pulled out a heavy, solid gold money clip. It was completely empty of cash, but the clip itself bore a distinct, deeply engraved crest. A roaring lion. He pressed it into B's palm, closing her thick fingers over it. "Keep this," he whispered. "You will be rewarded, Beatrice. I promise you." Before she could refuse, the old man turned and walked out into the night. Gary scoffed. "Great. You got a useless piece of junk from a crazy person. Pack your locker, B. You're done. Don't bother coming in tomorrow." B stood frozen, clutching the heavy gold clip. She had just lost her job. She had no money, and she was entirely alone. But as she watched Albert disappear down the dark, wet street, she couldn't bring herself to regret it. 3 days later, Bayard was sitting at the wobbly kitchen table of her cramped, mold-infested apartment on the edge of the city. The radiator hissed weakly, doing nothing to chase away the November chill. Spread out before her were a stack of final notice bills, an eviction warning from Concord Property Management, and a legal pad filled with frantic, hopeless math. She had pawned her television and her microwave, but it wasn't enough. She had applied to 10 different diners, but the moment managers saw her size, they made excuses about fast-paced environments. She was out of options. The gold money clip Albert had given her sat in the center of the table. She had taken it to a pawn shop yesterday, but the pawnbroker had taken one look at the lion crest, gone completely pale, and refused to touch it, telling her to leave his store immediately. At exactly 4 p.m., a heavy, rhythmic knock echoed through her thin front door. Bea frowned. She wasn't expecting anyone. She pushed herself up, her thighs brushing against the small table, and walked to the door. She unlocked the deadbolt and pulled it open. The air in the hallway seemed to instantly evaporate. Standing in her doorway was a man who looked like he had stepped out of a dark, expensive magazine. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and immaculately dressed in a bespoke charcoal Italian suit that probably cost more than Bea's life on paper. He had dark, slicked-back hair, a strong, angular jaw covered in a light shadow of stubble, and piercing, vivid blue eyes, the exact same eyes as Albert. Flanking him were two massive men with thick necks and bulging jackets that poorly concealed firearms. Bea's breath hitched in her throat. Her first instinct was fear. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice trembling just slightly, though she stubbornly refused to step back. The man looked at her. His gaze was intense, sweeping over her large frame, not with the typical disgust she was used to, but with a sharp, calculating assessment. "My name is Leonardo Romano," he said. His voice was smooth, deep, and laced with an undeniable, terrifying authority. "May I come in?" Bea knew that name. Everyone in the city knew the Romano name. They owned the shipping ports, the high-end casinos, and half the politicians in the state. They were the Mafia. "I don't have anything," Bea stammered, gripping the doorframe. "If this is about the rent, I'll be out by Friday." Leonardo's expression softened, just a fraction. "I am not your landlord, Miss Gallagher. I am here about my father." Bea blinked. "Your father?" 3 nights ago, an old man wandered into Rusty's diner in the pouring rain. You bought him a bowl of stew. Leonardo gestured toward her kitchen table, his sharp eyes catching the gleam of the gold clip resting there. "And he gave you that." Bea stepped back, her shock overriding her fear. She let him in. Leonardo stepped into her tiny, shabby living room, his sheer presence making the space feel microscopic. His men stayed in the hall, closing the door behind him. "His name is Albert," Leonardo said, slowly unbuttoning his suit jacket and looking around the dismal apartment. "He has severe, early-onset dementia. He managed to bypass our security estate in the suburbs and wandered into the city. We spent 3 days tearing Philadelphia apart looking for him. The doctors said if he had stayed in that freezing rain for another hour, his heart would have stopped." Leonardo turned to face her, stepping closer. The scent of expensive cedar and danger radiated off him. "You saved my father's life, Miss Gallagher, and from what my men dragged out of that pathetic manager of yours, you lost your job because of it." Bea swallowed hard, feeling incredibly self-conscious, standing in her cheap sweatpants and oversized t-shirt in front of this gorgeous, terrifying billionaire. I know what it's like to be hungry," she said softly, wrapping her arms around her thick waist defensively. "I didn't know who he was. I just saw a man who needed help." Leonardo stared at her. In his world, everyone wanted something. Everyone had an angle. People cowered before him, lied to him, or tried to use him. But the woman standing before him, with her soft, full face and nervous eyes, was completely raw. She had sacrificed her own livelihood for a stranger. Leonardo reached into the inner pocket of his suit and pulled out a thick manila envelope. He tossed it onto the kitchen table next to the gold clip. It landed with a heavy thud. "There is $50,000 in that envelope," Leonardo said flatly. "A token of my family's gratitude." Bea stared at the envelope as if it were a venomous snake. $50,000. It would pay her mother's medical debts. It would pay her rent for 2 years. It was salvation. But as she looked at it, a familiar, stubborn pride flared in her chest. She had spent her whole life being treated like a charity case, like someone who needed pity because of her size and her poverty. "No," Bea said, her voice suddenly steady. Leonardo's dark eyebrows stitched together. "Excuse me." I said no. Bear stepped forward, picking up the envelope and holding it out to him. "I didn't help him for a reward, Mr. Romano. I did it because it was the right thing to do. I don't want your blood money." Leonardo didn't take the envelope. He simply stared at her, genuinely shocked. A slow, dangerous smirk crept onto his lips. It was the first time in 10 years someone had told him no. "You are out of a job. You are about to be evicted," Leonardo noted, nodding toward the stack of bills. "Pride is a luxury for the rich, Beatrice. Take the money." "I don't want a handout," Bea fired back, her brown eyes flashing with defiance. "I want a job. I want to earn my keep." The room fell deadly silent. Leonardo studied her. She was a big, beautiful contradiction. Vulnerable, yet fiercely defiant. He felt a sudden, strange tightening in his chest, an intense urge to pull her into his world and never let her go. "Fine," Leonardo said softly, his voice dropping an octave, sending a shiver down Bea's spine. "You want to work? You work for me." Bea hesitated. "Doing what?" "I own a private supper club downtown, the Sapphire Room. The pay is triple what you made at that grease trap, and the benefits are comprehensive." Leonardo stepped forward, closing the distance between them until he was mere inches away. Bea had to tilt her head up to look into his striking blue eyes. "But understand this, Beatrice. If you step into my world, you belong to the Romanos. We take care of our own. Always." Bea's heart hammered against her ribs. She was standing at the edge of a cliff, looking down into a dark, thrilling abyss. She knew exactly who this man was, the violence he commanded, the danger he represented. But as she looked at the eviction notice on her table, she knew she had no choice. "When do I start?" she asked. Leonardo's smirk widened into a triumphant, predatory smile. "Tonight." The Sapphire Room was nestled discreetly beneath a restored 1920s bank building near Rittenhouse Square. There were no neon signs, only a heavy mahogany door guarded by 2 men in tailored tuxedos. When Bea arrived for her first shift, the sheer opulence of the place made her breath catch in her throat. The interior was a cavern of crushed blue velvet, cascading crystal chandeliers and polished brass. Jazz floated through the dim, smoky air, mingling with the scent of expensive bourbon and imported cigars. It was a world entirely built for the elite, and Bea immediately felt like an imposter. Her stomach churned as she stood in the center of the grand foyer, clutching her worn handbag. She was painfully aware of her size in a room where everything else seemed impossibly sleek and refined. The head hostess, a razor-thin woman named Vivian, with sharp cheekbones and a sneer that seemed permanently etched onto her face, looked Bea up and down. Vivian's eyes lingered critically on Bea's wide hips and thick thighs. "There must be a mistake," Vivian said, her voice dripping with venomous condescension. "Mr. Romano doesn't hire people of your profile for the floor. We have an aesthetic to maintain. Perhaps you're meant for the kitchen staff, or the dish pit." Bea felt the familiar, heavy crush of humiliation pressing down on her chest. She had spent her entire life shrinking under that exact tone of voice. "Mr. Romano hired me personally," Bea said, trying to keep her voice from trembling. "He told me to be here at 7. Vivienne let out a harsh, mocking laugh. "Leonardo Romano doesn't personally hire waitstaff, and he certainly wouldn't hire a fat girl to represent his club. Look at yourself. You'll barely fit between the tables in the VIP lounge. I'll call security to show you out." "That won't be necessary, Vivienne." The deep, commanding voice echoed through the foyer, freezing the blood in Vivienne's veins. Leonardo emerged from the shadows of the mezzanine staircase. He was wearing a pitch-black suit, no tie, his collar open to reveal the strong column of his throat. The sheer predatory grace of his movements made the entire room fall silent. He walked straight toward Bea, stopping entirely too close, his towering frame dwarfing her. He didn't look at Vivienne. His intense blue eyes were entirely focused on Bea. "Is there a problem?" Leonardo asked softly, though the edge in his voice was unmistakable. "No, Mr. Romano," Vivienne stammered, all her previous arrogance vanishing into sheer terror. Miss Gallagher's uniform. We don't have anything in inventory that will accommodate her proportions." Leonardo slowly turned his head to look at Vivienne. The coldness in his eyes was terrifying. "You are dismissed, Vivienne." Vivienne blinked. "Sir, clear out your locker. If you are still on my property in 5 minutes, my men will throw you into the alley." Vivienne opened her mouth to argue, saw the lethal promise in Leonardo's gaze, and practically sprinted away in tears. Bea stood frozen, shocked by the casual, ruthless display of power. Leonardo turned back to her, the ice in his expression melting into something entirely different, something warm, heavy, and deeply possessive. He gestured to one of his guards. "Bring it." The guard hurried forward with a large, matte black garment bag. Leonardo took it and handed it to Bea. "The uniforms here are cheap. They wouldn't do you justice," he said, his voice dropping to a low rumble. "I had this tailored for you this morning. Go change." Bea took the bag into the luxurious employee lounge. When she unzipped it, she gasped. It wasn't a standard uniform. It was a custom-made, midnight blue silk wrap dress. When she slipped it on, she stared at herself in the full-length mirror, unable to recognize the woman staring back. The fabric draped perfectly over her heavy curves, cinching at her waist and flowing elegantly over her wide hips. It didn't hide her size. It celebrated it. For the first time in her 28 years, Bea didn't just feel acceptable. She felt breathtaking. When she emerged from the lounge, Leonardo was waiting. His eyes darkened the moment he saw her. He let his gaze travel slowly down her body, taking in the soft, generous swell of her curves. It wasn't a look of fetishization. It was a look of absolute, burning worship. "You look exactly as I pictured," he murmured, stepping closer. He reached out, his knuckles lightly brushing against her bare shoulder, sending a jolt of electricity straight to her core. "Tonight, you work the high roller room. You answer to no one but me. Do you understand?" "Yes," Bea whispered, her heart hammering against her ribs. The night was a whirlwind. Bea moved through the club, serving $100 glasses of scotch to men in expensive suits. She noticed quickly that this wasn't just a supper club. It was a neutral ground for the criminal underworld. Men spoke in hushed tones about shipping containers, unions, and bribes. Around midnight, the atmosphere in the VIP lounge shifted drastically. A man named Victor Rossi, a notorious and deeply unstable capo from a rival syndicate, entered with 4 massive enforcers. Rossi was a loud, crude man with a scarred jaw and a terrifying reputation. He took the corner booth, demanding service. Bear approached the table with a tray of fresh glasses. Rossi stopped talking mid-sentence, his eyes locking onto her. "Well, well, well," Rossi sneered, a cruel smile twisting his face. "Looks like Leo decided to stock the place with heavy machinery. Tell me, sweetheart, how much do you weigh? Enough to crush a man, I bet." His men erupted into ugly laughter. Bee's face burned hot with shame, but she forced her hands to remain steady as she set the glasses down. "What can I get for you, sir?" she asked evenly. Rossi reached out and grabbed Bee's wrist with a crushing grip. "I didn't say you could speak, you fat cow. You stand there and look down when I'm talking." Before Bayard could even cry out, the sound of a heavy glass shattering echoed through the room. The music stopped. The entire club went dead silent. Leonardo Romano was walking toward Rossi's table, and the look of sheer, homicidal fury on his face made the air in the room turn to ice. Leonardo moved with a terrifying, unnatural silence. His men instantly fanned out across the room, their hands slipping beneath their tailored jackets, resting on the grips of their weapons. The patrons in the VIP lounge, hardened criminals, corrupt politicians, and wealthy socialites, collectively held their breath, pressing themselves back into the velvet booths. Victor Rossi didn't seem to notice the impending execution. He kept his meaty fingers wrapped tightly around Bee's wrist, twisting it just enough to make her gasp in pain. "I said," Rossi spat, glaring up at Bee, "look down." A massive, heavy hand clamped onto the back of Rossi's neck. Rossi didn't even have time to react. Leonardo gripped the rival capo by his thick neck and slammed his face downward with bone-shattering force. Rossi's skull collided with the solid oak table. The sickening crunch of breaking cartilage echoed through the silent room as blood exploded from Rossi's nose, staining the pristine white tablecloth. Rossi's 4 enforcers immediately jumped up, reaching for their guns. Before a single weapon could be drawn, Leonardo's men had them flanked, pressing the muzzles of silencer-equipped pistols against the backs of their heads. Leonardo didn't even look at the enforcers. He kept Rossi pinned against the table, his fingers digging into the man's scalp. He looked at Bear. "Did he hurt you?" Leonardo asked, his voice deathly calm, entirely devoid of the raging violence radiating from his body. Bear was trembling, cradling her red, aching wrist against her chest. She was terrified, not of Rossi, but of the absolute monster that Leonardo had just become in the blink of an eye. "No," she whispered. "I'm okay." Leonardo turned his attention back to Rossi, who was groaning, blood bubbling from his lips. Leonardo leaned down, putting his mouth right next to Rossi's ear. "You touched what is mine, Victor," Leonardo whispered, the lethal quietness of his tone far more terrifying than a shout. "You insulted a woman who possesses more worth in her little finger than your entire pathetic bloodline." "Romano, you're breaking the treaty," Rossi gurgled, trying to struggle. "Over a waitress?" "She is not a waitress," Leonardo said coldly. He grabbed Rossi by the collar and hauled him backward, throwing the massive man onto the floor. Rossi scrambled backward, holding his ruined face. "She is under my protection. If you or anyone in your degenerate family ever looks at her again, I will burn your shipping warehouses to the ground with you inside them. Now get out." Rossi's men grabbed their bleeding boss and practically dragged him out of the lounge, stumbling over themselves to escape the sapphire room. The moment they were gone, Leonardo snapped his fingers. The jazz band immediately started playing again, and the staff rushed forward to clean the blood off the table, moving with a chilling, practiced efficiency. The club returned to normal, as if nothing had happened. But Bea couldn't breathe. The walls were closing in. She had grown up poor. She had grown up bullied. But she had never been exposed to the raw, visceral violence of the Mafia. She turned and bolted for the employee lounge, her chest heaving as panic consumed her. She made it to the locker room and collapsed against the cold tile wall, sliding down to the floor. She buried her face in her hands, her heavy shoulders shaking with sobs. She was completely out of her depth. This wasn't a fairy tale. She hadn't just gotten a job. She had walked into a war zone. The door clicked shut, locking from the inside. Bea looked up. Leonardo stood by the door. The terrifying apex predator who had just brutalized a man was gone. In his place was a man looking at her with a heavy, agonizing vulnerability. He walked over and slowly sank to his knees, utterly unconcerned about dirtying his expensive suit on the locker room floor. He gently reached out and took her injured wrist. His touch was impossibly soft, a stark contrast to the violence she had just witnessed. He inspected the red marks left by Rossi's fingers, his jaw clenching. "I'm sorry you had to see that, Beatrice," he said softly, his thumb gently stroking her skin. "You almost killed him," Bea whispered, tears spilling down her cheeks. "Over nothing. Over an insult." "It wasn't nothing," Leonardo corrected, his vivid blue eyes meeting hers. "In my world, hesitation is death. If I let a man disrespect you, I signal to the entire city that you are unprotected, that I am weak. I will never let anyone make you feel small again." "I am big, Leonardo," Bea cried, frustration and fear boiling over. "I'm a big, fat woman from the slums. I don't belong here. I don't belong in designer silk, and I certainly don't belong in the middle of a mafia war." "Stop it," Leonardo ordered, though his tone was pleading, not commanding. He shifted closer, his large hands moving up to cup her face, his thumbs gently wiping away her tears. "Stop repeating the lies those pathetic people told you. You think I care about your size. You think I don't see how beautiful you are." Bea froze, her breath hitching as Leonardo leaned in. The scent of cedar and gunpowder surrounded her. "I have spent my entire life surrounded by beautiful, hollow people who would stab me in the back for $1, Leonardo confessed, his voice thick with raw emotion. "Then I watched a woman with no money give her last $20 to save a starving old man. You have a heart of pure gold, Beatrice. You are the most magnificent creature I have ever laid eyes on, and I am entirely, completely obsessed with you." Before Bea could process the confession, Leonardo leaned in and pressed his lips to hers. It wasn't a gentle, testing kiss. It was a sudden, desperate, claiming. His mouth was hot and demanding, his hands sliding back to tangle in her thick hair. A shockwave of pure electricity shot straight down Bea's spine. For years, she had felt untouchable, undesirable, a ghost in her own life. But right now, held against the hard chest of the most dangerous man in Philadelphia, she felt entirely consumed. She melted into him, her soft, heavy body pressing against his muscular frame, returning the kiss with a desperate, pent-up hunger of her own. When Leonardo finally pulled away, they were both breathless. He rested his forehead against hers, his chest rising and falling heavily. "You are not going back to that apartment," Leonardo whispered fiercely. "You're coming home with me. I'm going to keep you safe, even if I have to burn the rest of the city down to do it." Bea knew she should say no. She knew she was stepping past the point of no return. But as she looked into his eyes, she realized she didn't want to go back. She was ready to walk into the fire, The Romano family estate was a sprawling, stone-cut fortress hidden behind 20-foot wrought-iron gates on Spring Mill Road in Villanova, one of the most affluent suburbs outside Philadelphia. When Leonardo's armored Cadillac Escalade rolled up the sweeping driveway, Bey felt like she had been transported into another universe. There were no sirens, no shouting neighbors, and no smell of rotting garbage. There were only perfectly manicured hemlock trees, a fleet of luxury cars, and an eerie, absolute silence. The following morning, Bea woke up in the master suite. The bed was massive, draped in imported fret linens that felt like spun clouds against her bare skin. She lay there for a long moment, staring at the vaulted ceiling, the reality of the previous night rushing back. The violence at the Sapphire Room, the terrifying confrontation with Victor Rossi, and the raw, consuming passion of Leonardo's kiss. She had slept in his arms, his large, scarred hands resting protectively over the soft curve of her stomach. He was already gone by the time she woke, leaving a handwritten note on the mahogany nightstand that simply read, "Rest. You are safe here. L." Bea slipped out of bed, wrapping herself in a plush silk robe she found in the closet. It was terrifyingly expensive, yet it fit her generous curves perfectly, another silent testament to Leonardo's meticulous attention to her. She padded barefoot down the sweeping marble staircase, following the scent of brewing coffee. She found the kitchen, a cavernous space out of an architectural magazine, dominated by a massive custom Le Cornu stove. Sitting at the center island, bathed in the soft morning sunlight, was Albert. He was no longer the freezing, sodden vagrant she had found outside the diner. He wore a tailored cashmere cardigan, his silver hair neatly combed, his cheeks holding a healthy shade of pink. But as he stared blankly into his coffee cup, Bea recognized the terrible, hollow fog of dementia clouding his vivid blue eyes. "Albert?" Bea said softly, stepping into the room. The old man blinked, his head turning slowly. For a moment, there was nothing but confusion. Then, like the sun breaking through thick storm clouds, absolute clarity struck him. A brilliant, joyous smile broke across his weathered face. "Beatrice," he whispered, pushing himself up from the stool. "My sweet, kind Beatrice." Bea rushed forward, wrapping her thick arms around his frail shoulders. He hugged her back with surprising strength. "You look so much better, Albert," she said, tears pricking the corners of her eyes. "They told me Leo brought a woman home," Albert said, chuckling weakly as he pulled back to look at her. "I should have known it was the angel from the diner. My son is a brutal man, Beatrice. The streets of Philadelphia required him to become a monster so that our family could survive. But he is not completely lost. He brought you here. That means he still has a soul." Before Bea could answer, the heavy oak doors of the kitchen swung open. A man strode in, bringing the bitter chill of the outside world with him. It was Dominic Russo, Leonardo's underboss and oldest confidant. Dominic was a lean, sharp-featured man with slicked-back hair and eyes like black ice. He wore an immaculate bespoke suit, but there was a feral, unpolished violence about him that made Bea's skin crawl. Dominic stopped dead in his tracks, his dark eyes raking over Bea's large, soft frame wrapped in silk. His upper lip curled into a visible sear of disgust. "Well, well," Dominic drawled, his voice a harsh South Philly rasp. "I heard Leo dragged a stray dog home from the slums, but I didn't realize how much space it was going to take up. You must be the waitress." Bea felt the familiar sting of shame. but the memory of Leonardo's words from the night before anchored her. "I will never let anyone make you feel small again." She squared her heavy shoulders and lifted her chin. "My name is Bear." "I don't care what your name is," Dominic scoffed, walking past her to pour himself a cup of coffee. He completely ignored Albert, treating the former boss like a piece of furniture. "Leo is out of his mind. We are on the brink of an all-out war with the Rossi Syndicate. Victor Rossi is sitting in a trauma ward at Jefferson University Hospital with a shattered skull because of you. And instead of preparing for retaliation, Leo is playing house with a fat girl who doesn't know a damn thing about our world." "Do not speak to her that way, Dominic," Albert warned, his voice suddenly dropping into a chilling, authoritative gravel that perfectly mirrored his son's. Dominic rolled his eyes, taking a sip of his coffee. "Go watch your cartoons, old man." He turned his dead eyes back to Bea. "You think you hit the lottery, sweetheart? You think you're going to be the queen of the Romano Empire? You're a liability, a soft, massive target. In our world, liabilities get cut loose. If you have any brains in that thick skull of yours, you'll pack your cheap bags and run before you get us all killed." Dominic set the mug down with a sharp clack and walked out, leaving a suffocating tension in his wake. Bea's hands were trembling. She looked down at her plush robe. The luxury of the estate suddenly didn't feel like a sanctuary. It felt like a gilded cage. Dominic was right. She was a waitress from a moldy apartment who worried about eviction notices, not Mafia vendettas. She had brought war to Leonardo's door, and in the criminal underworld, weakness was always the first thing to be destroyed. The storm that hit Philadelphia 3 days later was torrential, a violent downpour that flooded the streets of the city and pounded against the reinforced glass of the Villanova estate. The sky was the color of bruised iron by 4 in the afternoon. Leonardo had been gone since dawn. Dominic had called an emergency sit-down at the Packer Avenue Marine Terminal, claiming one of the Rossi capos wanted to negotiate a ceasefire. Leonardo had taken his top enforcers, leaving behind only a skeleton crew of guards to monitor the estate's perimeter. Bea was in the kitchen, humming softly to herself as she stood over the La Cornue stove. She was browning chunks of beef in a heavy cast-iron Le Creuset Dutch oven, making the same hearty stew she had given Albert on the night they met. Albert was sitting at the island, peacefully working on a crossword puzzle from the Philadelphia Inquirer. For a brief, fleeting moment, the house felt normal. Then the power went out. The massive kitchen was plunged into shadows, illuminated only by the grey, stormy light filtering through the rain-streaked windows. The quiet hum of the estate's sophisticated security grid instantly died. Bea froze, the heavy wooden spoon clutched in her hand. "Albert, stay right there," she whispered, her heart kicking into a frantic, terrified rhythm. She crept toward the hallway, peering around the marble doorframe. The silence was unnatural. She should have heard the backup generators kick in. She should have heard the guards radioing the house. Instead, she heard the distinct, heavy thud of a body hitting the hardwood floor in the foyer. Panic seized her throat. She sprinted back into the kitchen, grabbing Albert by his cashmere sweater. "We have to move, now!" "What's wrong, Beatrice?" Albert asked, his eyes wide with childlike fear. The dementia had gripped him tightly today. He had no idea what was happening. "Hide," Bea ordered, shoving him into the massive walk-in pantry and locking the heavy wooden door from the outside. Just as she turned around, the kitchen doors burst open. 2 men dressed in black tactical gear stepped into the room, rain dripping from their jackets. They held silenced automatic weapons. But it was the third man who stepped through the doors that made Bear's blood run entirely cold. Dominic Rousseau, he wasn't wet. He walked in with a casual, terrifying arrogance, a silver revolver dangling loosely from his right hand. He smiled when he saw Bea standing alone by the stove. "Where is the old man?" Dominic asked, his voice echoing in the dark, cavernous kitchen. "Where is Leonardo?" Bea demanded, her voice shaking violently. Dominic laughed, a cruel, hacking sound. "Leo is trapped inside a shipping container at the naval yard, surrounded by 20 of Rossi's best shooters. He's dead. He just doesn't know it yet." He became weak, Bear. He broke a decade-old treaty over a fat diner waitress. "I made a deal with Victor Rossi. I give them Leo, and I take over the Romano family. But Victor wanted a bonus. He wanted the old man, and he wanted the woman who embarrassed him." Dominic gestured to his 2 armed men. "Grab her, and tear this house apart until you find Albert." The 2 men stepped forward. They looked at Bea, their eyes filled with the same mocking contempt she had endured her entire life. They saw a heavy, frightened woman. They expected her to cower. They expected her to scream. They forgot that Bea Gallagher grew up in the slums of South Philadelphia, and she had spent her entire life fighting for survival. As the first man reached out to grab her, assuming she was a slow, easy target, Bea didn't step back. She planted her feet, using her sheer, solid weight to her advantage, and swung the heavy, cast-iron Le Creuset pot straight off the stove. The boiling hot, greasy beef stew hit the first attacker squarely in the face. He dropped his gun and shrieked in absolute agony, falling to his knees as his skin blistered. Before the second man could raise his weapon, Bear let out a guttural scream, gripping the handle of the cast-iron pot with both hands, and brought the heavy metal down onto the side of his skull with bone-crushing force. He collapsed instantly, hitting the marble tiles completely unconscious. Dominic's smug smile vanished. He raised his silver revolver, aiming it right at Bea's chest. "You stupid, fat Bang!" The gunshot was deafening, but it didn't come from Dominic's gun. Dominic gasped, his eyes going wide as a blossom of dark red blood exploded across his immaculate suit jacket. He dropped the revolver, staggering backward before collapsing onto the floor, choking on his own blood. Standing in the doorway, soaked in rain and entirely covered in the blood of his enemies, was Leonardo. He was breathing heavily, a smoking pistol gripped tightly in his hand. He looked like the devil himself, his face a mask of absolute, unhinged violence. He hadn't been trapped. He had smelled the setup the moment he arrived at the docks, slaughtered the ambushers, and raced back to the estate, terrified he would be too late. Leonardo dropped the gun and rushed across the kitchen, stepping over Dominic's dying body. He collided with Bear, wrapping his massive arms around her, crushing her soft body against his soaking wet chest. He buried his face in her neck, his entire frame shaking. "You're alive," Leonardo choked out, his voice cracking with a desperate, terrifying relief. "I thought I lost you. I thought he got to you." Bea hugged him back fiercely, her own tears finally falling. She looked over his shoulder at the men bleeding on the floor, and the heavy cast-iron pot still resting by her feet. "I'm not a delicate flower, Leonardo," Bea whispered, her voice surprisingly steady. "I can take care of myself." Leonardo pulled back, looking at the devastation she had caused. He looked at the boiling stew, the unconscious men, and the fierce protective fire burning in Bea's dark eyes. The fear in his chest evaporated, replaced by a dark, overwhelming surge of awe. He didn't just love this woman. He revered her. She wasn't just a survivor. She was a queen entirely worthy of his empire. The aftermath of Dominic's betrayal was swift and absolute. Leonardo did not just clean his house. He cleansed the entire city. Within 48 hours, the remaining loyalists of the Romano family dismantled Victor Rossi's crippled syndicate. The shipping ports, the casinos, and the underground supply chains were seized. Rossi himself, still recovering in a secure ward at Jefferson University Hospital, was quietly visited by 2 of Leonardo's men in the dead of night. He was never seen in Philadelphia again. But winning a street war was one thing. Holding the throne was another. 2 weeks after the brutal attack in the kitchen, a mandatory sit-down was called by the old guard, the remaining bosses of the East Coast Syndicate. They demanded an audience with Leonardo at a neutral, heavily guarded compound in Bucks County. The old men of the commission were deeply unsettled. Dominic Russo had been a respected underboss, and rumors were swirling that Leonardo had lost his mind, breaking ancient truces and murdering his own lieutenant over a common, heavy-set waitress from the slums. The air in the grand wood-paneled boardroom of the Bucks County estate was thick with cigar smoke and tension. 5 seasoned Mafia dons sat around a massive mahogany table. Leonardo sat at the head, his face an unreadable mask of cold authority, and sitting directly to his right, holding her own space, was Bear. She wasn't hiding in the shadows. She wore a custom-tailored, deep burgundy gown that hugged every generous curve and swell of her large frame. Her dark hair was styled immaculately, and her thick shoulders were pulled back with a regal, uncompromising posture. She had survived poverty. She had survived Dominic. And she was done apologizing for the space she occupied in the world. Carmine Sabatini, a grizzled boss from the Brooklyn faction, slammed his thick fist onto the table. "This is a joke, Leo," Carmine barked, his dark eyes glaring at B with undisguised contempt. "We let you wipe out Rossi because he was a loose cannon. But we will not sit here and take orders from a man who lets a diner waitress sit in on a commission meeting. She has no blood right. She's a civilian, a massive liability." Leonardo's jaw clenched, his hand sliding subtly toward the weapon inside his jacket. "Careful, Carmine. You are speaking about my future wife." The room erupted into murmurs of outrage. A boss marrying a woman outside the families, a woman with no pedigree and no money, was an insult to their traditions. "Wife or not, she has no place in our business," Carmine growled, standing up. "Your father, Albert, built this syndicate on respect and tradition. He would roll in his grave if he knew you handed the keys to the kingdom to some soft girl who poured coffee for tips." "My father is still very much alive," Leonardo stated, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "And he is the one who brought her to me." "Bull!" Carmine spat. "Albert's mind is gone. He doesn't know what he's doing, and this girl is just a charity case you dragged out of the gutter." Bear had heard enough. She didn't look to Leonardo for permission. She didn't shrink under the collective glares of the most dangerous men on the East Coast. She stood up. Her sheer physical presence commanded the room, silencing the murmurs instantly. She reached into her designer clutch and pulled out the heavy, solid gold money clip engraved with the roaring lion. She tossed it onto the center of the mahogany table. It landed with a heavy, resounding clack, sliding right to a halt in front of Carmine. The color instantly drained from Carmine Sabatini's face. The other bosses leaned in, staring at the golden clip as if it were a holy relic. The room fell into a dead, absolute silence. "I didn't steal that," Bea said, her voice steady, ringing with an undeniable, natural authority. Albert Romano placed it in my hand the night I met him. He had nothing left. He was freezing to death, and he gave me the only thing he had of value. I kept it. Carmine swallowed hard, his hands trembling slightly as he looked at Leonardo. This is the Founder's Crest, the original seal of your grandfather. It hasn't been seen outside the Romano vault in 40 years. By ancient Sicilian tradition, Leonardo said, his vivid blue eyes locking onto the stunned bosses. Whoever holds the Founder's Crest is recognized as the ultimate protector of the family. My father didn't just give her a piece of gold. In his brief moment of clarity, he looked at the woman who sacrificed her last $20 to save a dying stranger, and he chose her. He passed the torch. Leonardo stood up, resting his large hand proudly on Bee's waist. Beatrice Gallagher is not a liability. She is the matriarch of the Romano family. She is my equal. If any man in this room has a problem with the woman who holds my grandfather's seal, you can draw your weapons right now. No one moved. No one breathed. Slowly, Carmine Sabatini lowered his head. He stepped back from the table and offered a deep, respectful bow to Bee. One by one, the other bosses followed suit, bowing to the curvy woman from South Philly who had just conquered the underworld without firing a single shot. Bea looked at Leonardo. The ruthless mob boss looked back at her with absolute, unwavering devotion. She had spent her entire life feeling too big, too much, and completely invisible. But as she stood in the center of the room, the undisputed queen of a criminal empire, Bee realized she was exactly the right size for the throne. And that is how a desperate, curvy waitress from a grease-stained diner became the most powerful and feared matriarch in the city's underground. Bee's massive heart and unyielding bravery proved that true strength isn't about fitting into society's narrow molds. It's about having the courage to protect the people you love, even if it means taking over a mafia empire. If you loved this thrilling story of passion, power, and ultimate revenge, hit that like button, share this video with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more intense, jaw-dropping romance dramas.